Good morning, everybody. I would like to start with land acknowledgement. We're based in Toronto, Ontario, and we acknowledge the ancestral and traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, who are the original owners and custodians of the land on which we stand and create. On behalf of Walk with Web team, I'm delighted to welcome you all today for the relaunch of Liberated Africans website. My name is Karthikeya Chadha, and I'm the CEO of Walk with Web. Incorporated in 2020, Walk with Web is an internationally operating independent organization with a mission to support, develop, and sustain digital aspects of social sciences and humanities research. Our service, called Regenerated Identities, is a new concept of gateway services created to support the development and sustainability of digital humanities projects with special focus on Africans and the African diaspora research. Currently, we are supporting over 15 African digital humanities projects that are using our custom-designed graphical user interface, fulfilling their specific needs, thus enabling development of robust digital interfaces for the World Wide Web. Our team, clients, and partners comprises of internationally recognized professors, researchers, and students based at university in Canada, including York University, University of Toronto, Trent University, University of Ottawa, Dragon Lab at University of Waterloo, Royal Military College of Canada, McGill University, UQAM, as well as other abroad, such as Digital Slavery Research Lab at University of Colorado Boulder, King's College London, University of Essex, and University of Worcester. Through internships, long and short-term employment programs for a diverse body of undergraduate and graduate students, we help researchers improve the spread of their research for academic inquiry, teaching, and the public. Our projects are funded by international granting agencies, including the Social Sciences Humanities Research Council of Canada, MyTax, the Mellon Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities in the United States, Arts and Humanities Research Council and Wellcome Trust in the United Kingdom, and the French National Research Agency. Can we have the video, please?
It's time to walk towards a new digital age. Look back from the past to record for the future. Transform history to dynamic technology. At Walk with Web, our projects have expanded exponentially ever since the company was founded. We concern ourselves not only with what a research project needs, but how we can make it more accessible. Our digital platforms enable participation of an accessible community, as well as limited incorporation of commercial data of scholars. We exemplify the partnership between industry professionals and academia to allow history to carry out in digital spaces. We collaborate together with renowned institutions to create the vision of the project. We're the solution to the long-standing problem of research sustainability. And together, we can walk towards a brighter future.
Today, our team is extremely excited to launch the new version of the Liberated Africans. Professor Henry Lovejoy is with us to present the new website. Professor Lovejoy is an associate professor in the Department of History at the University of Colorado Boulder and is the director of the Digital Slavery Research Lab. He's working on multiple projects related to the history of slavery, abolition, and African migration, which intersect spatial statistical models, digital archives, and teaching resources as public history. He has published an award-winning book on Yoruba in Cuba, as well as articles in the Journal of the Royal Statistical Society, Journal of African History, History in Africa, Slavery and Abolition, among others. He has also published co-edited books volume, The Liberated Africans and the Abolition of the Slave Trade 1807 to 1896 in 2020, and Regenerated Identities, Documenting African Lives in 2022. Multiple awards have supported his research, including the Mellon Foundation, National Endowment for the Humanities, SHRC, the Hitchens Center for African and African American Research at Howard University, among other opportunities through CU Boulder. He is affiliated with CU Boulder Center for African and African American Studies, Center for Digital Data and Digital Scholarship, and Lab for Interdisciplinary Statistical Analysis. He is also one of the founding board of directors of Walk with Web. Without any further delay, I give you Professor Lovejoy.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming here today to listen and learn how to operate the new website, liberatedafricans.org. I really want to acknowledge all of the team, Carter K., Maria, Vincent, and others at WWW for helping put this together. The tech support here today, sound and broadcasting, as well as the Congress, which we're currently attending, and the Canadian Association of African Studies. So Liberated Africans really began about 8 years ago in my dad's basement. I was worried about the job market, didn't think I was going to get a job in academia, and I went back to college and began to learn how to code, at which point I began putting my dissertation research online, which focused on liberated Africans in Cuba in particular. My main goal at that time was really just to put that research online and make it accessible, since I was thinking I wasn't going to get a job. So it started really with 44 cases, and I presented that once I had put it online in 2015. I went to a conference at Harvard and amazingly received a grant in the middle of the conference. After that, I began organizing panels at ASA, at the African Studies Association. I helped co-organize a conference here at York University that was dedicated to liberated Africans. And that's when I got a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities to incorporate over 500 cases from Sierra Leone in Freetown. So by about 2018, the second version of Liberated Africans had relaunched. This was to make and improve the searchability of it so that you could actually look and search across the different cases, particularly from Cuba and Sierra Leone. Following that, we did an edited volume on liberated Africans, which really led to sort of exploring this data, these people in global perspective. So now I'm pleased to present this relaunch, which is really made possible in part by the Mellon Foundation and New Directions Fellowship, as well as opportunities through the University of Colorado, Boulder. So the first thing I would like to do is just show that this website, we've designed it for simplicity. We really want this to be a public history website. So we're only really talking about 10 menu items where we can find information. So we're not going to be overwhelmed with large amounts of information. And this all would not be possible without this very large team of people who have helped in different components of this project. In particular, Carter K. Chada as CEO of Walk with Web. He is really the programmer behind this, but as well as the lead developer, Maria Yala. I really appreciate their work and the other members of this team. There's a large list of advisors and collaborators from history and other scholarship that relates to liberated Africans. These are a variety of people I've consulted. They've given me advice on regional studies related to liberated Africans. They provided documentation, and they've really helped me conceptualize in the broader sense. I've also been able to, through my digital slavery research lab, employ for paid and for credit internships and numerous students who helped me put together what is the Anti-Slavery Legislation Archive. And I'll get that in a moment. And then, of course, all of the sponsors who have made some of this possible. We too are very concerned about the ethics of this project, because essentially what we're discussing are government-run schemes to liberate people and then indenture them. This was another type of slavery, and this hasn't been fully recognized to the full extent in the scholarship, especially in global perspective. So we acknowledge land and the ideas through the copyright that this is for fair use, this is for everyone to use in the public domain. We also wanted this website to really be a teaching resource for different students at various levels, from undergraduate, graduate school, as well as K through 12, depending on level of understanding. So we've put together a page of brief essays that just really conceptualize the problem of liberated Africans. This is really a misnomer. This is what governments called these people that they were capturing under anti-slavery law. They'd often capture slave ships and take these people into courts where they would then be indentured following a so-called liberation. So I really use liberated Africans in very heavy quotation marks throughout this because I think it's important to point out the contradiction and the hypocrisy of what governments were doing in the past as they claimed they were ending the slave trade, yet they were essentially re-enslaving people through a different type of slavery, different from chattel. So these different types of essays contain links. I've outlined in particular the anti-slavery legislation in global perspective. I've organized with my team of interns through my lab over 500 pieces of anti-slavery legislation, which provides the legal definitions for liberated Africans. And embedded throughout is various links that lead to some of the very key pieces of legislation so that students can access them as well as researchers as they're looking through it. And I'll get into that a bit more as I show you the full anti-slavery archive. So this really began with the United States in 1800. These were the first captures, but it really picked up after 1807 with the British Abolition Act, after which there were numerous treaties between Great Britain and other nations, and then other nations began enacting their own legislation, which led to more and more different types of liberated Africans as these policies were adapted and adopted and changed ever so slightly. So the British were really talking about three types of liberated Africans. We have the condemnations, so these are people seized as property by a government, liberated, and indentured. We have other systems, such as the French, who introduced purchasing people, liberating them, and then indenturing them. And then the third and final category is asylum. So as colonization of Africa began, enslaved Africans would show up at different consulates, present themselves, seeking liberation, after which they were indentured. So the concept of liberated African has changed over time. This is why I've included this quite lengthy glossary of terms where you can begin to look at the different conceptions of liberated Africans as they've changed over time. These appear in different records around the world. They're in different languages. But really what we're talking about here are the people who were condemned or purchased or sought asylum under the acts or treaties for the abolition or suppression of the slave trade, so all of that legislation. So, and then under the state control, they were then liberated, again in heavy quotation marks, and immediately indentured. So scrolling down, you can see that there's quite a lot of different terms for liberated Africans. This is something that you'll be able to see online now. So in Spanish, German, Dutch, Malay, Turkish, Italian, and there's certainly going to be other definitions as I was talking with people at this conference, particularly in Swahili and other languages as well, Hausa in particular too. So I'm not really talking about certain types of freedoms like self-purchase. This is really, I want to emphasize, under anti-slavery legislation that led governments to capture people, and indenture them. When we're talking about liberated Africans, we're really talking about three key events that happened during this judicial process. They left from somewhere in Africa, they were captured or seized by a government, and then they underwent this judicial process. So we are following these three things at this point in time. There is a fourth category which we will add in the future related to settlements, where people were moved from where their indentureship occurred to other places around the world. So the departures, we've begun by looking at this in terms of a regionalization of Africa that relates to the pre-colonial period, which has nothing to do with the colonial or modern day map. And I will get into it as I get into more of the mapping features to show you what some of these regionalizations mean. Once they would have left some region within Africa, there is usually a capture, and this relates to the suppression of the African slave trade, in particular blockades that were set up along the coast, that were occurred on land in different circumstances, where governments would capture from slave owners, enslaved people, for this process of liberation and indentureship. This has all been possible to put onto a map so we can begin to see the different, how the suppression of the slave trade occurred over time. We can begin to see patterns where it begins off the coast of Africa, particularly in 1807, but also in the Caribbean. We have numerous different navies that were involved in this process: the British, Portuguese, United States, the Netherlands. And this really shows sort of a lot of what could be economic development that infringes upon Africa over time. So this process happened over a long century, and we can begin to understand through different imagery this process where, Navy ships would, in often violent interactions on the sea, capture these things. And we can begin to link in this imagery to the case files. So you can click on this photo and it will take you to the case file of the Esperanza. After the capture, we're involved in this judicial process where people would be unloaded from the slave ships. This often involved a registration of people involved, not in every case, but we're talking about 200,000 people who likely had their names documented from between 1800 and 1920. We're still in the process of transcribing a lot of this information, associating it with the different case files, but we can begin to see these sort of representations through abolitionist propaganda that often ignored the other side of it, which was the re-enslavement, the indentureships that would have occurred. So these registers are very important for a number of reasons. They're extremely important in terms of genealogies in certain places. These are the only records we have of people removed from slave ships, removed from slavery from within Africa. They're highly informative for a lot of analysis. It's a large amount of people and one of the most cohesive sets of documentation for people removed from the slave trade. But these are not just done for humanitarian reasons. These are the evidence of the contracts of indenture. While they recorded African names, age, sex, height, and physical descriptions, the idea, and sometimes photographs, the idea is that they really began to keep track of these indentureship programs. So the idea was people could return after the terms of indentureship, after several years, and they were supposed to re-identify themselves from these lists based on physical descriptions, names, so on and so forth. This did happen on occasion, but generally a lot of these people were disappeared from historical record, or they moved to different settlements in different parts, and it wasn't necessary overall. So this is why we will be moving on to settlements is the next data set within this, because part of this history is actually very complicated and it isn't fully recognized, in my opinion. What we're dealing with in terms of the settlements of people, for example, people were taken to Freetown, Sierra Leone, where they would have been registered, but after British emancipation, they moved over 40,000 people from Sierra Leone to the British Caribbean. So after British emancipation, these people were moved again to work on plantations in the Caribbean. We see this pattern as well in the Indian Ocean, people being removed and taken to places like the Seychelles or Mauritius. And this is really another type of enslavement. The French did this too. They would purchase people in Africa after their second abolition in 1848, and they moved about 80,000 people in the Atlantic and Indian Ocean world. So settlements will eventually become a very important component of this, but we're trying to get this data out as fast as possible so other researchers, students, schools can begin using it. But as we know, digital humanities projects are an evolution of progress. The final component of this is the image gallery. This is something that we're also continuing to build. We have a sample image gallery at this point, but through the research over the past couple of years, it's been possible to identify much more imagery than what was previously expected, especially when you put it into the global perspective. So this imagery is incredibly important. It involves some of the earliest and first photographs of enslaved people from slave ships, the only ones that are in existence. And these are the ones that we really want to identify, whether through their paintings or prints, sketches, including a lot of the government officials who may have had their portraits done. So the research behind this was actually really made possible through digitization efforts that are ongoing. This is a huge part of historical scholarship in this day and age, is taking photographs of archival materials. And so from this large list of different digital projects, I've been able to, during COVID, actually create the bigger case list, which now involves over 5,000 cases. So I've been able to access a lot of documentation without actually leaving my home. And this wouldn't be possible without numerous scholars, archives dedicated to taking pictures of books page by page. There are many people in this room today who have digitized the Sierra Leone Public Archives, Paul Lovejoy, Suzanne Schwartz, Katrina Kiefer, Carter Kay as well, among others. Other people have also donated data sets, which I've incorporated into the metadata scheme, which basically means what are the columns of information that I'm using. And so they donated data sets and I've adapted it so that it would function within the system, and I do want to recognize their scholarship as well. You can learn more about the metadata scheme. You can look at the terms that are in use by clicking on different components, seeing which regions have been used, for example, or places that appear within all of the data. So this is just a way to sort of present what information has been collected, and this was largely developed earlier on, so you can see a PDF of some of the earlier metadata schemes. So with that in mind, a lot of what I've really wanted to do is locate a lot of this information on maps. We're really, is my screen? There we go. So this here is the Anti-Slavery Legislation Archive as it is shown on a map. Let me just check my. So this is what I've been building with students in my lab. I created an inventory of all of this. So we can begin to sort of filter information based on year. Hold on, I'm having a slight technical difficulty. So we can begin. Please bear with me. So we can begin to click on different types of legislation at the point of where they were signed. You can begin to find different things, in particular, for example, the 1807 Abolition Act. I might have to take a pause here as we sort this out. So we can begin to see some of this anti-slavery legislation archive. You can click on different details. And once it uploads, you can begin to see all of the legislation that is there. This in particular is the 1807 Act, which would really define the indentureship and apprenticeship programs that happened. So we can see other things as well, just using the British as an example, but here's the 1833 Emancipation Act, for example, and we can find other treaties that existed around the world. These included between the British and Portuguese, the British and Brazilians, British and Spanish, and so on and so forth. What has not been previously recognized, I think, in the anti-slavery legislation is the numerous amounts of treaties that were signed along the coast of Africa among different slave trading states and peoples who existed along the coast. So as this transition came out, again, we can zoom in and begin to see different types of legislation that were signed, which at that point of contact, usually through gunboat diplomacy. The archive too, we can look at it in terms of a list so that it's easier to search. You can filter by year, but I've really spanned from 1792 when the Danish first enacted anti-slavery legislation, which didn't go into effect until 1803. Others will be added. There's obviously things that can miss and improve, but this goes right up into the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There is a direct line between this legislation and the UN Declaration. So we can see this progress through the colonization, different anti-slavery laws that were signed in the late 18th century through the foundation of the International Labor Organization and the League of Nations as well. You can look at it as a table view or as a card view as well, so just for ease of access in terms of this information. I really want to thank my students as well who helped with this. They were very integral to sort of bringing it together as well with this part of it. So once we look at all the laws and treaties, eventually we'll be able to connect those treaties to particular cases under which they were tried at various courts around the world. So this is sort of, on this page we have several tabs that are associated with these maps. The first one is the departures. This is where people would have left Africa. So we can begin to look at different types of data sets based on these regional departures. So in terms of the Western Bight, which is also known as the Bight of Benin in historical scholarship, you can see that upwards of 60,000 people who would become liberated Africans originated from this region. If this is a confusing terminology, each of these regions comes with a link that connects to a separate teaching resource called africanregions.org. And in this website, we provide very brief explanations about the regions, where you can learn about the problems in nomenclature, as well as the different types of kingdoms that would have existed there, the geography, key ports of embarkation, as well as major peoples who would have lived in the region as well. We decided to map this regional distribution of Africa out, so you can click on all of the various regions with a brief explanation as well. This can be used as an independent teaching resource in various different types of classes related to African history as an introduction. These regions were developed by numerous scholars in African history because of this problem of having to organize data and information about people from Africa in the pre-colonial period, which really have no relationship to colonial or modern day boundaries. So we're circumnavigating that by trying to educate a little bit more about the history of Africa, especially in the colonial period. So here you can see that the biggest distribution came from which was West Central Africa, sort of north of the Kwanza River. This is where the largest port of embarkation in the slave trade, Luanda, was located. And you can pull up all of these information about the various cases that are associated with this region. We can do it for East Africa because this is a global problem, so we had to really regionalize the continent in this way. We have the map view, table view, a timeline as well, and of course filters where you can select based on courts, different types of courts, governments, as well as departure regions, and of course a timeline. So any researcher, it's a long list of courts. We probably have about 200 different courts, if not more. And so there's a lot of information depending on researchers' interest, how they would want to access that information, and choose the appropriate categories that they would need. The second tab on this page relates to the blockade. So this map shows all of the documented capture locations of liberated Africans around the world. You can see the different types of navies in the legend. So the coloration really demonstrates which navies were capturing slave ships at different points in time. Sometimes they would follow trains of enslaved people inland, and they would capture them, and they could be associated with a particular slave ship as well. So you might find some dots in continental regions. It's not just the maritime blockade, but it's heavily associated with it. At this point, I have about 3,000 capture locations, and this, again, you can filter by court, by time, by region of departure, as you would need. So this is a highly interactive map. I have two categories here. One's captures that involved people. These were cases where registrations often occurred in many circumstances, but after a certain period of time, 1835 for the Spanish, 1842 for the Portuguese, there is a new legislation where it was possible to capture empty ships that had equipment for slave trading on them. Prior to this time, you couldn't. So we can eliminate the empty ships that are involved in this and begin to sort of look down into where all of these different capture locations were located. So you can take this one as an example. In the documentations, that would have been the coordinates as recorded by the British Navy sea captain, who gave those coordinates, marked it down because the moment of capture was very important for the trial in terms of seizing people for liberation and indentureships. So we can begin to look more deeply at some of the cases, and you can pull up information, which court it went to, and then we begin to have these documentation associated with these cases. In this case, you can see here, there's actually the registration of the people on board. So this ship left somewhere in the Western Bight or the Bight of Benin, and we can even see Yoruba names documented within these lists. We'll also find Hausa, Fon, among other ethno-linguistic naming. Now, these were obviously recorded by British, Spanish scribes, so the spelling is different, but they are worthy of analysis. And just to show another example, you can see the difference in documentation from different archives, whether it's the Sierra Leone Public Archive. We provide citations that are complete, but you can begin to see these sort of how we can attach documentation to these different points of information. So the final tab within the map is called Liberated Africans. This really relates to the location of the trials. So Freetown, Sierra Leone, for example, was very important, and you can begin to look at all of the different lists of people and the cases that were there. These are attached to the same ones I was beginning to show you related to the blockade of the slave trade, but it's just presented where those trials actually occurred. So you can even begin to see through filtering, for example, you could look at the colonial and foreign offices and apply those filters, and this will show where the British were highly involved in the trials related to liberated Africans. So this in particular would show 38,000 who were tried at the Vice Admiralty Court in Freetown, Sierra Leone. Here is the Vice Admiralty Court in St. Helena, for example. So you can really narrow down these searches in different ways. And just for some of the scholars in the room, you can see the extensive list of the different types of courts. Consular courts, which related to captures in the Ottoman world and Middle East, where enslaved people would present themselves seeking asylum at different consulates, and then they'd be turned over to local Muslim courts where they would receive emancipation certificates and usually indentured. We can search by region. So just to show the various mixed commissions, for example, these were the first bilateral courts of so-called humanitarian effort, where Anglo-Spanish, Anglo-Dutch, Anglo-Portuguese, and we can filter these out to begin to sort of see what that would look like in global perspective. So again, we can click just on those. So about 64,000 people passed through the mixed commissions. There were several mixed commissions in Freetown, Sierra Leone, and those would be all of the cases associated with it. So finally, within this mapping category, we have a people data set. At this point, we haven't fully had the capacity to link up transcribed lists of the registers of liberated Africans of those contracts of indenture, but we'll be able to map where those registers were occurred, associate them with specific cases if you want to do a genealogical study perhaps, or understand where those information are most likely associated. So this is sort of part of the in process. People on the slave voyages team, myself included, we began transcribing these liberated Africans. Katrina Kiefer is working on that with her students at Trent University as well. So there's going to be multiple transcriptions because transcribing documented African names creates different problems, especially when a British clerk was writing a house and name, for example. The spelling is going to be off. There's multiple ways to interpret these records. So finally, in terms of the resources, this is sort of the archive side, so it's just lists of what actual documents are on the website. We have a couple of thousand, but I think now with this system in place, there's a bit of an urgency to begin uploading more and more records. This is organizing things on a government by government, court by court, case by case basis. So historians would be familiar that these records are scattered throughout the world archives. They're shuffled up like a deck of cards within multiple volumes of information. And so the task now is to organize the kings with the kings and the queens with the queens so that we get all of that information in its appropriate location. The final resource is the image gallery. We're in the process, likely this summer, to begin linking this to slaveryimages.org, creating new categories for liberated Africans, at which point we can begin to add to this little collection that I began in 2015. So this provides just sort of some visual representation of this process. You can really see how the treatment of people within it, the captures of slave ships, but there's much, much more information. Here is some of the earliest photographs of liberated children, liberated African children in the Indian Ocean world, as well as various things that liberated Africans would have done. So just to sort of wrap up this presentation, I think what we're really trying to do here is organize all of this information for a number of reasons, not only to facilitate research, understand more about Africa and the African diaspora, but also to really highlight the oppression that was occurring through different government. These schemes, this process is something that governments at the time were very proud of. They touted it. They said, this is humanitarian effort. We're the ones doing this. And to a certain extent, that's true. But they often failed to recognize that they were actually using and looking for free labor in a different format. So we're really trying to highlight that contradiction of humanitarianism and what is essentially would be considered today as a crime against humanity. Another major message that we're trying to portray is the innovative ways in which we can talk about historical scholarship, where we can begin to look at different types of information, map it, locate it, make it accessible to a general public for ease of comprehension. This is not possible by just historians. We need to incorporate interdisciplinary activity, and that's why the collaboration with Walk with Web is so very important. Without their support, without Maria, Carta K, and all the others at WWW, displaying the information in this way, it becomes so much harder to represent to different people. And I think they've done such an exceptional job that I can envision using it for my own research as well as many other people as well, here and abroad. The other thing is we're really talking about trying to understand more about genealogical histories as well. And these lists of liberated Africans are very important, especially for places like Sierra Leone, other places in the Caribbean. We have a knowledge of oral traditions about people in places like Grenada and Trinidad, where there is an oral history associated with liberated Africans. I would assume the same is true in places like the Seychelles and Mauritius. So organizing a lot of these registers of liberated Africans, these contracts of indenture is very important for that history. These are the documents that can be linked and associated with other records about enslaved people. But the history is large and it's complex. And so displaying it in these different ways really facilitates understanding, comprehension. And with that comes some responsibility. And for that, I'm talking specifically about different moves of governments today to recognize their involvement in the slave trade, for policymakers to understand how systemic racism had occurred at various levels of government over time. So we're talking about informing people about reparations. And I think this is probably the most important thing, because here is the evidence of what governments were doing in the past as they claim to end the slave trade. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Lovejoy. So I will now open the floor for questions. Anyone who's joining us online can drop their questions in the live chat, and we will have someone ask Professor Lovejoy. So yes, Suzanne, can we get, we'll get you the microphone. Yes. Yeah.
So the first comment, wow, Henry, it's incredible, and I can just see all the applications you talked about, my own research, my students. So in terms of how I've seen this website develop, the amount of work that's represented and the research and its clarity is just going to have all sorts of incredible applications. So my question is, you talked about the people, the category of people. So obviously cases that we've worked on from Sierra Leone where you can track life histories. That's in Freedom Narratives. Presumably there'll be a link across to that. But I'm wondering, so we heard about Damalola's research yesterday of tracing. Will there be a place where we can have, say, essays about individuals that we've traced, as well as the links across to Freedom Narratives? Do you think that's part of the potential?
Oh, absolutely. This was really to release the case list, the maritime blockade in particular as well, and to get that information out into the public. But there's so many different ways in which we can use this project to do things such as biography and include personal stories. But the challenge is to make it accessible to everyone. Yeah. So keeping things short, I think, is a difficult thing sometimes for historians. But it's definitely possible, and I think there will be many examples. I have envisioned a biography page where you could really begin to pull out some of these very key biographies. You know, people like Samuel Ajadi Crowther, you know, he becomes the first bishop of Nigeria, what would become Nigeria. And so there's so many stories about the individuals. So this really shows, you know, agency within this process. You know, these are victims of government schemes, but they have stories as well, and those are really important to be able to tell.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Also, we have a town just in Mombasa, a small area of Mombasa that is called Freetown, where we had people who were brought, they were called Matekas, you know, they were brought in by the British, and one of their descendants later became a big broadcaster in Kiswahili in Kenya, Leonard Mambo Mbotela. Some of their family members have written biographies about themselves, so this is, it's a great pleasure. So I hope some of his stories will show up on your website.
Yeah, definitely. I've included Freetown in these data as well, in these information. So hopefully that can provide more information to these families as well.
Yes.
I think that is equally important. You know, I think the potential and expansion of what is now, I think is fully possible, but there's still a lot of work ahead. Especially when we start incorporating settlements and resettlements of indentured Africans.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It's so inspiring project. And I'm a bit curious regarding the website as an educational tool beyond the academic research. If you have plans for translations for other language, Portuguese, Spanish, French.
That would be ideal. You know, what I prefer to do is to put the names of courts, the names, the documentation itself in the original languages. I think this is incredibly important. I think translation services online through Google are getting much, much better. So I think this will be something we will be adding in the near future. Obviously, it requires native speakers of different languages to really translate and make sure that it's grammatically correct, simple to understand, But this is something, that is in the works. We also envision having lesson plans set up within the website as well, likely under resources. But again, this is in time, so we can develop different exercises for different levels of education, where people can begin to look at specific pieces of legislation that are important and how those related to different cases and trials and what happened to the people involved, whether that's through biography or mass migration.
It's, Henry, this is a major project. This is that involved, and I really congratulations for this and congratulations to all of you. In particular, in my case, of course, I work on the Indian Ocean work. So my question for you will be, what are the challenges that you're facing integrating the Indian Ocean massive? So what are the support that you're getting from the scholar there, from different institutions? Because as you notice, for instance, I noticed one of your images from Mauritius. The register of the Liberated include images. Many of them, almost the 90% of them are from northern Mozambique. So when I was based in Mauritius for a couple of months, I saw these resources that allowed me to trace back the history of this individual. So I would like to know, what are the support that you need for the Indian Ocean work? What are the challenges that you're facing in that part, to improve your project? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks very much, Abu. I think there's a lot of challenges in this global perspective. One, gaining access to all the archives. In part, the digitization that's been happening on an increasing scale needs to continue. I think there needs to be more support for that. It's a very tedious job, as many of us in this room have experienced. But I think that is very, very important so that more and more people can access that information. Consulting with scholars of the Indian Ocean world. The Indian Ocean is complex because of the movement from Zanzibar to the Comoros, around Madagascar and the Mascarenes. As well as transportation towards the Middle East and Asia, in particular the west coast of India. That movement is actually quite difficult to map. In many circumstances, slave ships were captured. The trial would occur at Zanzibar, but the people were taken somewhere else, perhaps the Seychelles or Mauritius. So the documentation the scattering of documentation is really the complicated problem. Also thinking about the history of slavery in the Middle East and Mediterranean world, there's still a lot of difficulties discussing that in certain circles, and I think that causes an additional problem, especially when we're tracking people's movement into the Middle East. And so this is why we need to inform people that this did happen. And it happened on a much larger scale than what was recognized in the literature up until this point. But that's been the case everywhere. We find these problems in the Atlantic as well. People taken to Sierra Leone and then taken to British Caribbean colonies, or from St. Helena to British Caribbean colonies. We have liberated Africans from Brazil taken to the Caribbean or back up into Sierra Leone. So this is where I think the settlement and resettlement expansion will really begin to help with that process. Now, how to show that on a comprehensive scale, we've begun discussing this, but I think it's very important to continue consulting, see where scholarship goes, collaboration in particular, and interdisciplinarity.
What about the archive, the community archive? So that the one that are not inside the institution, for instance. This year in September, the liberated Africans from northern Mozambique, based on Durban, South Africa, they are organizing a big celebration. This is people that have information, that they have a family archive. Are you including these kind of sources to your project?
I would like to, very much. it's obviously difficult for one single person to gain access to different types of communities, to gain the trust to be able to listen to the oral traditions, the genealogies, the family histories. In the edited volume that I published, there's a chapter in there related to oral traditions from Grenada. You know, this is by Chantal George, and has heritage to Grenada. And so this requires more scholarship, more collaboration, donation of information, where we can begin to explore these and unpack what people remember or thought about these processes from the descendants of today. So I think, yes, I mean, this is just the tip of the iceberg, in my opinion. There's so much more work to do on this particular project in so many different capacities, and that's certainly one of them.
Could you comment on the implications of this work for the Voyages database in terms of, I mean, these people were all, well, most, even on land, these people who were enslaved and then are transferred into another system. But in the scholarship and in the popular understanding of the transatlantic slave trade, for example, the Voyage database has, of course, been extremely influential, but it seems to me that what you're showing is that it's really an undercount of what the true numbers of people that were involved in terms of the movement of slavery, not just across the Atlantic, but in the Indian Ocean too.
Yeah, Slave Voyages is an extremely important resource, as we all know. It has been accessible since 2009 online, and about 1/3 of the data that I've used here derives from Slave Voyages. And I say derived because their metadata scheme was interested in departures and arrivals, but this doesn't necessarily relate to the events that were happening through the judicial process. So I've added in a new column essentially for that capture. Sometimes in Voyages, the dates are misaligned in terms of where people were leaving from, their arrival. They could have used capture dates in some circumstances. So there was a lot of correction and updating of the Voyages data in particular. Voyages also includes about 1,000 empty ships. These are not immediately clear in the Voyages data set. It's documented, but it's really buried down at the bottom of their data and voyage outcome. So I think differentiating between full and empty ships is very important because these are inbound vessels that were on their way to pick up people, but they never did. And so showing this as part of this process, I think, clarifies some of that information as well. I think there's been an over-reliance on the Atlantic slave trade database in the scholarship because of different types of slavery, such as this one that involved quote-unquote liberation, followed by indentureships. So this is, it was born from the suppression of what is slave voyages, but it's a difficult way and look at that information when you're grouping it with over 350 years of history. So this is a transitionary period as we moved away, as the world moved away from chattel slavery into wage labor, but they needed the labor still, and this was the ways in which to do it. So the British were removing people from Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch slave ships and taking them and using them in their own colonies. So, I mean, I don't want to discredit voyages, it's extremely important, but I think there's other ways in which we have to begin to look at this information, especially in the 19th century, especially with its association with the suppression of the slave trade, and I don't think that's always recognized. So this is why I've really shifted the unit of analysis from a voyage, which has to occur at sea by and large, to cases, which then opens up slavery enslavement that occurred on land and not just through counting ships in the ocean. So this includes things like the capturing of canoes, or the seizure of barracoons, or people who were registered on land in the Portuguese Empire. These are part of that process that I think begins to show it in more detail than what you could see on voyages at this point in time. Expanding into the Indian Ocean, that's certainly in their plans, but I think this begins to show that more global African diaspora for one of the first times, in my opinion. So having that really puts things into a different context, which is also why the legislation archive, it becomes very important, because we can begin to associate, a trial at the Anglo-Spanish court to the Anglo-Spanish treaty, and this provides much deeper context that's very easy for researchers, students, the public to follow.
Hi, Henry. Some people in the room might not be aware that the debate about slavery and a backlash about slavery research is very much a regular feature of debate in British newspapers at the moment. And the public history narrative goes something like, why are we looking back at the problems of slavery and our involvement? After all, we liberated. So I think this is going to be a really important corrective, particularly in terms of when you talk about the relationship to reparations. So it's a very live debate in Britain at the moment, and slave trade suppression is always used as the counterpoint to studies of showing British involvement.
I agree, but we have to keep in mind that it's not just Great Britain too. It's France, Portugal. One thing in the scholarship is there's also a tendency to think the British liberated, quote unquote, the most liberated Africans, but in fact, the order is Portugal, France, and Great Britain. So we're, through these expanded estimates, we're also not just dealing with those discussions in Great Britain, but elsewhere too, because there is this involvement, where states enacted this legislation, but they still just weren't ready to accept that these people were free. They still treated them as property. They were condemned as property. They were disposed as property. And this is really where we can begin to show how the legislation, right up into the UN Declaration of Human Rights, is sort of rooted in this systemic problem.
Any questions online? No? Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Professor Lovejoy, for doing this for us. And I can only say it has been fantastic working with you on this website, for sure.
Thanks again.
Well, thank you. And thank you, everyone, for coming for this event and for this relaunch. The website is now live, so you can go online on liberatedafricans.org, and you can navigate through it and look at the whole website. And at the end, I would just like to thank Congress and York University for allowing us to host this event on campus today. Thank you, everyone. And right after this, we will have a group picture. So I would like to invite everyone to just come here, and we'll take a picture. Thank you.
Sounds better.